you have been following me, then you are aware that we're kind of in a bit of a holding pattern in the Ukraine war. It's not that I don't think there expect to be conflict. In fact, I think the Ukrainians are going to launch a serious offensive. But we're not going to get our real fight until the spring, when the mud is gone and the Russians have 500,000 new troops in the fight and the Ukrainians have done all that deferred maintenance on all that Russian equipment that they've captured. Then we're going to see the two of them really go at it. Until then, we're going to have this idea that the Ukrainians are on the front foot, and they are, and that the Russians are reacting poorly and badly, and they are. But while all of that is going on, it's not like the Russians don't have tools. As we started to see a few weeks ago, and as we're going to see more and more intently moving forward, the Ukrainians have the momentum. They're getting more and more gear, and the Russians know that that's not a tide that they can blunt. So what they're trying to do is to destroy the ability of Ukraine to function at all as a country by going after water and power infrastructure, particularly in the dead of winter. The logic being that if they can break the Ukrainians' ability to have a modern society and industry, then the rest of the war really doesn't matter, because the capacity of the Ukrainians to fight and to resist and to advance simply dissolves into nothing, and then the war is over and the Russians just walk in and take over. That's the logic anyway. How it's going to play out in real time is some immense human suffering on a scale we haven't seen yet. And remember, we've already had 1/3 of the Ukrainian population uprooted and displaced or become refugees. So the scale is already pretty big, and the scale of what's coming is going to be even bigger. Several Ukrainian cities have populations over 1 million, and if you remove the support infrastructure that allows you to support a population over 1 million, you no longer have 1 million people living there one way or the other. To that end, Zeihan on Geopolitics, that's the firm that's bringing you all of this, chooses a different charity every few months. Right now we're going with MedShare specifically because of the Ukraine Fund. MedShare provides medical assistance to communities who, for whatever reason, are unable to provide it themselves. So not simply places that need medical assistance, that's a long list. Places that are down on their luck because of factors beyond their control. Places that normally would be able to provide for themselves who just need a helping hand for the moment. We're going to have a series come out this week on issues that have come out of the Ukraine war in terms of economics and strategy and everything else. We're going to start with something that the Swedish government started announcing this past Friday, when they started releasing bits and pieces from the forensic work that they have done on the Nord Stream bombing. Now, Nord Stream is a natural gas pipeline that goes under the Baltic Sea from the Russian mainland to the German coast. And when it was operating, it was providing the German economy with 40% of their natural gas usage. And without it, we are talking about the beginning of the end of Germany as an industrial power. More on that later in this series. But the new news is that the Swedes have identified the type of explosive, and they've actually gotten samples from within the pipeline, which means that they've got their nose so far deep into where the evidence would be that they know exactly who did it and how. For weeks, Sweden has been unofficially pointing the finger at Russia. Sweden has by far the most capable navy on the Baltic Sea. Sweden has by far the most advanced sonar and forensic capability in the area. And on the day that Nord Stream was bombed, they started quietly telling their European partners that it was definitely the Russians who did it. And if there's anyone in the space that has the ability to identify what actually happened, it would be Sweden. However, they have not made their findings official in any possible way until now. And the question is, what has changed? And the question is, why have they not? Unfortunately for the Europeans, the answer is pretty simple to the second questions. If they admit that the Russians are deliberately destroying critical European infrastructure, then that requires action. It, in the parlance of the United States, makes Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. And countries that kind of fall into that category, you don't trade with. And this, at least at this moment, has not been an option for the Europeans at all. Even with Nord Stream offline, Russia remains the number 3 supplier of natural gas to the continent. It is the number 1 source of the inputs that allows the Europeans to make fertilizer or to smelt aluminum. This is the raw material that goes into their steel. This is the raw material that goes into their copper. This is the raw material that goes into the European semiconductor sector. This is timber. You remove all of that from the European system, and there is no way you don't have something that is at least as bad as the 2007 to 2013 financial crisis in the Europe space. This is the kind of thing that would trigger a recession that it's very possible that the Europeans wouldn't recover from, because we are well past the point where Europe was a net consumer of goods. Europe has aged. The demographics of the continent are sharply terminal, and it has far more people in their 60s than their 50s, than their 40s, than their 30s. So the business model for Europe today is to take raw materials from somewhere else, metabolize them into finished goods, and then export them into markets that can actually consume. Without the Russians, they lose that first step, and the entire economic model goes away. Now, the sanctions that the Europeans have put on the Russians to this point were done with this in mind. The whole idea was you phase things out over months or even years so that the European system has a chance to adapt, to either get new suppliers or more likely go through some very significant economic restructuring so that on the other side of this, the Europeans aren't nearly as dependent upon the imported materials no matter where they came from. The Nord Stream investigation threatens to throw that all into a tizzy, because if the Swedes actually do come out and provide the proof that everyone seems in Europe to know that the Swedes have, then all of a sudden everybody has to make some very specific decisions. And even if the Europeans don't do it, with that evidence out there, the Americans, under existing law, really don't have much of a choice. And then the Americans will have to stop trading with any country that is still trading with the Russians. And in that sort of circumstance, the entire European economic and social model goes away in a very, very short period of time. This is one of those situations where the truth will not set you free, but the truth appears to be about to come out. Next time, we'll dive into the energy situation in specific, give you an idea of what's coming down the pipe. Which talks about why the Russians are doing what they're doing right now, and why Ukraine is really only the first step in a multi-step military operation. Big facts section on specifically what's going on now in energy markets and what you should expect as the Russian energy output simply falls off the market altogether. Third up, get a little bit more recent here. This one's only 3 years old. This is Disunited Nations. There's a big fat chapter in here on Russia specifically, and explains why the Russians are going to make one last grand grab for empire before the whole system falls apart on them. And then finally, most recently coming out in June, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, where the others are the rise and fall of great nations kind of books. This one's more on the economic after effects. So in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, what happens to global energy? In the aftermath of a Chinese collapse, what happens to global manufacturing and transport? Anyway, all sales, all 4 books until at least the end of the year. I think I'm supposed to say here that they all make great stocking stuffers, but I think it's more accurate to say that these are more I told you so books if you're going to give them as a gift. So keep that in mind. There's going to be pushback.